welcome to Brain Chat. I'm Dr. Mitzi Joy Williams, your board-certified neurologist and MS specialist, and my mission is to engage, educate, and empower those affected by MS to become an active part of their healthcare team. Here on Brain Chat, we'll be discussing all things MS, health and wellness, advocacy, and we'll even throw a little bit of music and music therapy in there as well. Thank you so much for joining us, and stay tuned for the next episode. Hello. Hey, everybody. It's Dr. Mitzi, the nerdy neurologist. So excited to be here with you on a Monday night talking about one of my favorite topics, which is diversity in clinical research. First, Brain Chat wants to thank our sponsor, the National MS Society. And thank you to all of those who are viewing. We got an exciting show tonight. I am so excited about what we're going to discuss. And I think that, it's going to be an amazing discussion. And I just look forward to getting right into it. So let me introduce my guest. So tonight we have Nana Apong Owusu, who is a senior clinical research associate. She's a graduate of the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, as well as the University of Illinois at Chicago. She has maintained a career as a clinical research within the pharma industry for well over a decade. So she's got plenty of experience. She's been interested in encouraging, promoting diversity within clinical studies. She was recently diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in November of 2022. And this has been interested in promoting clinical trials within the field of multiple sclerosis and within the MS community. Additionally, her personal interest in physical fitness has led to an interest in advocating for the health benefits associated with physical activity for those living with multiple sclerosis. She has recently started a foundation called Misunderstood, which is really, I got a t-shirt to prove it. I don't have it on tonight, but I do have the t-shirt. So definitely looking forward to some amazing things coming from that, and talking about physical activity for those who are living with the diagnosis of MS. Welcome.
Hi, Dr. Williams. How are you?
I'm doing excellent. How about you?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
Good. So I'm looking forward to us having a really cool discussion, because you have several perspectives to provide, right? Mm-hmm. Both as a clinical researcher, as well as a person living with multiple sclerosis. Mm-hmm. So why don't we just get right into it? So tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of how you got involved in the field of research in general.
Okay, so the field of research, I think is kind of interesting. I like to call it a secret society. It's not so secret these days, but when I got into the field of research, it was secret. Mm-hmm. I was in school with the intention of going to medical school. I was pre-med in undergrad. I went through the MCAT about 4 times. My scores fluctuated up and down. My plan was to do an MPH-DO program. Mm-hmm. And with my scores fluctuating, I decided to go ahead and get my MPH first with the intention of then going back to medical school. And in my programming for my master's program, I found out about clinical research, mm-hmm. The phases of clinical research, and mm-hmm. I kind of deviated based on some colleagues of mine and classmates who also were in med school and then were in clinical research. So that's how I found out about the field. I then moved into a coordinator role, mm-hmm. and then into my current role, which is a clinical research associate, or a monitor, as we call it in the field.
Wow. So it was interesting. So I knew about research, but I didn't want to do it. So I call myself the reluctant researcher because I remember, and I probably have said this a million times on Brain Chat, my first question to my pre-med advisor was, can I get into medical school without doing research? And she said yes. And I was like, cool. And so now my whole life revolves around research, which I think is really ironic. But later in my career, I really, really began to recognize the importance of research and how it really moves the science forward, not only the very nitty gritty science, like learning what the cause of MS is, but the clinical science in terms of how we treat people on a regular basis. So I kind of had the opposite experience, but nonetheless, here we are. So tell us a little bit about your diagnosis journey, if you don't mind sharing a little bit about kind of how that occurred.
Sure. Well, from what I know, anyways, I feel like my diagnosis journey has been not only a blessing, but very fast. I started experiencing symptoms. I'm pretty in tune with my body, so I knew something was off, but I didn't think it was that serious. I kind of just laid around for a weekend, and then with that and the symptoms not going away, I took myself to the ER. I asked for testing. They gave me a CT scan, and the CT scan came back normal. So they just kind of attributed all of my symptoms to possibly a vitamin deficiency or an imbalance or some type of pinched nerve. Well, with that being said, I went to go get lab testing. 2 days later, my vision went blurry, almost double. That stayed for a few days. I went to go get testing from an eye doctor. Everything was coming back normal. And so they basically recommended that I see a neuro-ophthalmologist. But with me being unable to get into any neurologist within the month, or not even the month, the year of 2022, everyone was telling me March or April of 2023, and this was early November of 2022.
Wow.
I then took myself back to the ER and basically told them that I need to get an MRI, and they did that. And with that MRI, I was diagnosed with MS. So from the time of my first onset of symptoms to my diagnosis was just a week, and I know that most patients don't have it that fast.
Wow. So that is amazing. And it sounds like a large part of that was you advocating for yourself, right? And saying, okay, listen, if I can't see the neurologist for 3 or 4 months, that's not going to cut it. We got to do something to try to get me a diagnosis and figure out what's going on. And so did you feel like your research background helped you to kind of do that? Or, was it just your, listen, somebody's going to listen to me today?
I think it was a combination of both. Just knowing how the medical field is. I also have a brother who is a pharmacist in the industry. So I kind of knew about that, and I just knew that I had to advocate for myself, as you said.
Yeah. So that's amazing. So a week is definitely not many people's story. So, thank you so much for sharing that. So let's talk about research in general, right? So I talk a lot on Brain Chat about the importance of research, about the importance of, the research populations really reflecting the people that will be, using certain treatments, the people that will be, using devices or all of these things or these medications, right? Because we want to make sure that everyone is included. So tell us a little bit about, how you got interested in that and how that is important to you, as a research monitor, but also as, a person living with a chronic condition where we need more research in more diverse populations.
Well, of course, as we know, most of us in minority populations are not represented in medicine in general, as well as in research populations. So that's always been something that's important to me. But even more so now that I'm a person living with a diagnosis, I think it's very important. I've always thought it was important. And one of the things that in my past I've even used as an example is the fact that things such as hypertension or diabetes are very prevalent in Black populations, or even in Africa in general, which my family is from Africa, but we don't see clinical research trials in Africa.
Right.
So it's always kind of like, well, that's where a lot of our population is. There's a large incidence there, a large prevalence, but we're not doing research there. So how is our research really accurate?
Absolutely. And I think that's so important, thinking about, some of the more recent trials. One of the trials I'm involved in, the Chimes trial, we are very intentional about trying to at least find one site on the continent, right? So, obviously people who are African, descendants, who've been living in the US, I've always been very interested in the comparison, to those who are from the continent, and how there may be similarities, differences, because for many people, particularly when we talk about ethnic minority groups, like from Hispanic backgrounds, there's a country or place of origin, so, Hispanic Americans who are Mexican American, we can refer them back to Mexico, Spain, et cetera, but we really don't have that direct comparison, with African Americans, here in the States. So I think it's very important, not only that our research reflect the people that are living here in the States, but that it reflects the people who are affected by these conditions
Exactly.
around the world, right? And
Yes.
there are certainly many parts of the world where really virtually no research is being done, and that absolutely needs to change.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
So let's talk a little bit about kind of where we are. What kind of progress have you seen, as part of the research community since we began this conversation, right? So this conversation about diversity in clinical research is not new.
Mm-hmm.
It's been going on for decades, right? As I can attest to some of my colleagues and friends that I've worked with, and I'm sure some of yours, this is not a new conversation. I do feel in the past couple of years that we made a little bit more headway since the pandemic and many of the issues with,
Mm-hmm.
racial disparities and health equity that we saw with the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Tell me what you've seen in terms of progress, in the past couple of years, or if you've seen progress in the past couple of years.
Okay, well, in my opinion, I've seen progress in terms of people being more open to clinical trials,
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily, thinking of it as them being guinea pigs, because we oftentimes hear that, well, I don't want to be a guinea pig. I don't want to be the first person to try this research or for them to try
Mm-hmm.
this on me. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that, like you said, with COVID, especially, more people have been exposed to what a clinical research trial is and just the effects of it. So people are more open to it.
Okay.
In terms of industry, I personally don't feel that there has been that much advancement in terms of diversity in clinical trials. I think that a lot of pharmaceutical companies are starting to think along those lines, but I think we still have a long way.
Yeah. So let's go back to patient perception, right? So I
Mhm.
do a lot of work in the space. I sometimes consult and talk about clinical trials and how people, can maybe adjust their protocols to get more people involved. And I think one of the biggest things that the word that always comes up is mistrust, right? And so I think it is an important word, but I think, it's important to recognize that, from some of the research that's been done, it's well recognized that people want to participate even if they do have some mistrust,
Yeah,
right? So we can't necessarily use that as an excuse, for certain marginalized communities to not be involved. I think that sometimes that perception that people don't want to be involved will lead researchers not to even ask
that's
people
true.
to be involved in research. And so I think it's really important. There was a study that we did with the MS Minority Research Partnership Engagement Network, which is a group of multiple, clinicians, scientists, people living with MS, industry partners. And we all kind of met up and said, okay, well, what is the issue? And we did this big survey that got published in the International Journal of MS Care. And what we found was that most people had positive attitudes toward research,
Mhm.
even if they were concerned about, being experimented upon. Some people were concerned about not receiving good care or adequate care.
Mhm.
But even despite that, people wanted to be involved. And two of the biggest issues were they did not know where to find out about studies,
Mhm.
or nobody asked them. Tell me your thoughts about that.
I think that's very important, and I think is very accurate. Oftentimes, especially in underrepresented communities, people don't have access or the knowledge of clinical research trials, or even where to go to find out.
Right.
Most people don't even know about clinicaltrials.gov, in which you can find all clinical research trials that are happening, whether they're closed, they're recruiting, they're active
Mm-hmm.
and not recruiting, but you can find out everything. Even if you have some type of indication that you want to get more research on, you can simply type that in and
Mm-hmm.
you'll get information on what trials are going on across the nation and the world.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it's very true that a lot of people don't know about it. And that might be the first approach in terms of exposure to clinical trials as well as openness to it.
Mm-hmm. So let's kind of just take a step back and let's talk for a few minutes about the different phases of research. I think this is really important, and also a little bit about the different types of research. So, oftentimes when we talk about increasing diversity, we talk about clinical trials, which are major trials where there is some, therapy, maybe a medication being tested or a procedure. But there are other types of research people can be involved in. But before we get to that, just break down a little bit for us. What are the different phases of clinical research, and where is the point at which most people would wind up getting involved in a clinical research study?
Okay, so there are four basic phases of clinical research. Phase one, in most indications, usually is a healthy subject population in which it's a very small population, probably less than 20 people. And they're, I don't want to say experimenting, but whatever the experimental factor is, whether it's a drug or a device or something like that, is being used in a healthy population primarily. And I say primarily because I worked a lot in oncology trials, and obviously in oncology, no one is a healthy patient. Everyone obviously has some type of illness. And so for that matter, you're not going to get any healthy subjects. So phase one is a very small group of people in which there's an experimental or investigational product, as we call it, being used. Phase two is in which the population size opens up. It's a couple hundred people. Usually it's testing some type of, when we're talking about drugs anyways, testing some type of efficacy. They're actually trying to establish a dose that might be used. So there might be a few different doses versus a placebo that are being experimented upon. And, by the end of that phase, the pharmaceutical company will have an idea based on research of what is the best drug and what's the best drug in terms of benefits versus risks. And that's always the main thing, is we want to have more benefits versus risks. Of course, you may have some risks, but we always want to have more benefits versus risks. So in phase two, it's more so about establishing a dose. And then with that, you go on to phase three, in which you may have thousands of patients, and the dose has been established at that point in time. And then you're using it to find out the efficacy in the population and how well it actually works. You're more so testing the safety at that point in time, adverse events, if anything were to happen in comparison to the previous phases. And then phase four is marketing, where sometimes it's already marketed at that point in time, or even in phase three. But phase three is where you'll see the bulk of people involved in a clinical trial, maybe phase two, but primarily phase three. I like to also tell people that don't know much about clinical trials, if they don't know much or they're having some type of reservation, I oftentimes tell them that it's not always a new drug that someone is testing on you. Sometimes it's already marketed for something else, and there's research that shows it may be beneficial in a different indication, or it may be beneficial used in combination with another drug. And so for that, you might have two things that are already marketed, have already been approved by the FDA, and they're using it to see if it has better effects or, more benefits. So it's not always that it's just something brand new that you're not, familiar with.
Right. Straight out of the test tube, right? It's not straight out of test tube in your vein or in your mouth or something like that. How long does this process take, right? So one of the things that I try to stress to people when we talk about clinical research, and a lot of times, even after a drug is newly approved, certainly people are concerned. And so, I try to explain the fact that this research process usually takes place over years, and that it is also ongoing, that oftentimes people will enter what we call an extension phase. So after that study is done, they're continued to be monitored over time, and certainly if there are new side effects or issues that pop up, they're reported to the FDA. It's not like we say, okay, the drug is approved, we good, we don't have to look at it anymore, and whatever happens, let's shoot the craps and we'll see what happens. So tell us a little bit about how long this process takes.
Like you said, years. And when I say years, it's not just a couple years. One phase alone, and I would say the shortest phase usually is phase one. And that takes almost a year sometimes, maybe a little bit less than a year, some months to a year. But then phase two can take 2 to 3 years itself. And phase three oftentimes is maybe even 5 years. So the whole trial sometimes can take up to 10 years ultimately. So it's definitely a lot of research, a lot of time that's invested. Of course, when you compare, and I like to use COVID because a lot of people were introduced to clinical trials through COVID. But when you have something like that where they had, experimental and they were able to get an expedited approval, that's different. It's not always like that, but it was basically because of a need.
Right. And most trials are not like that. And, there was also a difference in the fact that there were so many people with this condition at one time all over the world that it probably was not very difficult to recruit for a trial like that. Other trials, it may take months and months, or even up to a year to fully recruit enough people to complete that research study. And I think it's important for people to recognize that, when something comes to market, it has been studied for years, and those people, many of them are continued to be continuously followed over time, and if there are new issues that arise, those are definitely reported, so that by the time it comes to market, we know about those side effects. So when we think about, you know, um, industry, right? So you said, people's perception has changed some, which I would agree with, and I agree. And I think the other piece is that researchers' perceptions have, I think in some cases, been changed to where they recognize people want to be involved, but we need to do a better job about educating people, making sure they understand, the goal of the trials, things like that. What about industry? So there's a lot of talk, with the FDA about the importance of involvement, of increasing diversity in clinical trials, but we've seen some areas where there's been movement. There are some trials, as I said, I'm participating or a part of a phase 4 clinical trial focused on Black and Hispanic people, but what do you think the next steps are to really move the needle, or why do you think the needle really hasn't moved where that's concerned?
I think there's a few different reasons that the needle has not moved. In my opinion, and that's for me speaking as a researcher and me more so being frontline because I'm actually going to these research sites. And then on the flip side, working with the pharmaceutical companies as well. I think one of the primary reasons is that oftentimes we have what we call key opinion leaders or KOLs, and they're oftentimes high enrollers, meaning that they're the physicians that are bringing in the most patients for these trials, and they have relationships with the pharmaceutical companies. So I think that sometimes it can be a plus, but it also can be a barrier because that specific physician may not have adequate representation of what the community in that specific indication is. Right. And oftentimes the pharmaceutical company is still going to go to that specific physician because they know that they, one, have a relationship, and two, because that physician has the patients and has a history of bringing in the patients that they need for the clinical trials. So I think that in itself is a major barrier because we can't always just depend on the same physicians. And it's not necessarily just enrollment. Sometimes we talk to our managers about the fact that these specific sites might not necessarily be the best in terms of giving quality data, but those are things that we have to deal with within the research side.
Yeah.
So that's definitely a major barrier in my opinion.
Yeah, so it's kind of like if you keep doing the same thing, you'll get the same results. And so certainly there are many places that do an excellent job of doing research.
Exactly.
But I think that, being very intentional. So the word that I've been using since 2020 has been intentional, right? So, a lot of times people will invite me to be a part of the process. How can we make our trial more diverse? But it's like you've already picked everybody you want to be involved. And these are the same people that are always involved. And so how do you expect to get something different if you're doing the exact same thing? So looking at ways to involve the community, looking at ways to invest, maybe in some, sites that, may not have all the machinery of some of our big academic practices, but how do we invest in those, people who want to be involved in research, but maybe don't have the resources of some larger places? And then also, how do we find creative ways to partner with the community, right? So maybe it's a matter of, again, in the case of MS, we have our large MS centers, we have our academic centers, but there are many people who care for the MS in the community. Researchers, neurologists, who may partner with our larger centers to get involved in research. And so I think that's something that definitely needs a lot of work. I think about the Chimes trial, I keep mentioning because it's the only reference I have, but, we were very intentional about the sites, and we enrolled very quickly, with some of the traditional sites, but some non-traditional sites. And so, how do we, find that combination to invest in some people, as well as to look for ways to partner with the community? I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done where that's concerned.
I agree. And I think that you raised a good point about finding sites and sometimes even having to invest in the sites. And investing in the sites may be a combination of both equipment, or money, and even
Right.
training as well, because we have
Training.
what we call research naive sites. And there are some
Mm-hmm.
physicians that want to be involved in research, but don't have exposure to it, don't have experience, and they're overlooked oftentimes. Or they
Right.
don't even know, who to contact to be
Right.
involved in a research trial. I think
Right.
that the pharmaceutical companies also have to do a better job in the very beginning of when they're doing site selection. So, for
Mm-hmm.
instance, in my role, we have what we call feasibility questionnaires, and they send
Mm-hmm.
out feasibility questionnaires to these different sites. And it's pretty much the focus is always, how many patients do you have in this specific indication? Well, how many
Right.
patients can you get us? And it's kind of like a guarantee. Well, this site sees this many patients. This is their target population. This is how many screen failures that we think we might have within that target population. But I think if the sponsors or the pharmaceutical companies did a better job of mandating a specific number of sites that have to be from different populations, we would
Mm-hmm.
have better representation within those clinical research trials.
Absolutely. And the sites are the places or the clinics where the
Mhm.
research is done.
Yes.
So for instance, there are some sites that are associated with academic centers. We're in Atlanta, so we have Emory. There are some large private practices that have a large piece of research, but there again are some other smaller ones where maybe they can't guarantee that they'll put 10 people in the trial, but maybe building a relationship with that site will continue to garner more research over time. Now, let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk about the role of the researchers, right?
Mhm.
So I have a lot of researchers, a lot of colleagues who say, well, we can't get people in the trials, right? Or some of them will say, well, we don't have this population, but they live in like somewhere like Chicago. I mean, I'm throwing it out. I'm not saying anybody from Chicago told me they don't have, but like large metropolitan areas
Mhm.
where you would expect the populations to be diverse, but people are saying they still can't get people in trials. How do we kind of work on and dealing with that, right? Because even though we're saying this is something that needs to be done, there's really not any there's really not any, people don't have to do it, right? So it's like, okay, it's a good idea, but you don't necessarily, they're really not consequences to
Mhm.
not enroll in diverse populations. So how do we work on that aspect of it from the researcher side?
I think that is going to be difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there are physicians that have the patient population, and then, like you said, there's some that just don't have the patient population, or
Mm-hmm.
they don't know how to increase the diversity within their own patient population. I
Mm-hmm.
think that a lot of the pharmaceutical companies do a good job of providing incentives, but then there is a fine line between providing an incentive and then it seeming like bribery. And then we
Right.
also have what we call in research professional patients, where unfortunately there are some patients that will go from different site to different site and try to do the same trial at different sites just so that
Mm.
they can get the little incentives, whether it's $50 per visit or
Right.
$100 per visit. They
Right.
have those, but I mean, I think they've done a good job of creating websites in which you have to be verified as a patient in order to
Mm-hmm.
get into a clinical trial, so they can make sure that there is not duplicates, because also that affects the research when we
Mm-hmm.
have the same patient who's basically being represented in
Right.
the trial in different places. But I think that
Right.
there just has to be some type of incentive, as well as more of a research outreach from the physicians, just to
Mm-hmm.
kind of extend their branches within the community and sometimes outside of the community. I don't know if physicians can network. I know that there's roundtable discussions.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they can just network with other physicians in the area and just kind of
Mm-hmm.
partner up and somehow increase the patient population.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's really important. I think it's important for number one, people to recognize that this is important, and that again, the goal is for the population in the studies to reflect, the people that are actually getting these medications.
Mhm.
So I got to see a really interesting question in the chat here that says, how do you trust side effects and even what new drugs say they will do when the test population doesn't look like me, for
Mhm.
instance, doesn't look like, a person of color. So what would you say, to that type of question?
Well, I mean, I think it's a great question.
Mhm.
Well, first and foremost, we don't necessarily, when drugs are marketed, Fortunately for the consumer, we don't have a listing that says, well, this specific drug was tested on X amount of people that are of African American descent versus those that are Caucasian and Hispanic and vice versa. So we don't have that opportunity to actually scrutinize and say that this is not representation or representative of our population, but we just have to trust and hope that it is, and hope that, like, again, the benefits outweigh the risk in the general population.
And of course, when we think about it, we are very much more alike biologically than different, so we don't want to, there were many years spent basically trying to prove that we were similar, that, brain function, our ability to take care of ourselves, that all those things were similar. So we don't want to make it like we're so different biologically that we have to, do completely separate studies, but there are some nuances, right? So maybe there are some small, biologic differences that may lead one person to react in a different way. We also have to think about things like social determinants of health, right? A person's ability to access care, for instance, in MS and many other diseases, we have data or research that shows that certain populations do worse, right? But in order to understand that, we have to get involved in the research, right? To understand, what is the role of, access to the doctor? What are the roles of discrimination? What are the roles of, diet, exercise, other diseases or comorbidities like diabetes and hypertension that may be, higher in certain populations. So in order to kind of tease all that out, clinical research and clinical trials are some of the best way to do that, because it's a very controlled type of research where people have access to theoretically the same care, the same interventions, the same frequency of being able to go to the doctor, imaging, all of those types of things. And that will help us kind of tease out maybe what some of these differences are. And there's another question that says, why don't they do African diaspora specific research?
That's a good question. That's what we're trying to figure out. Why don't they do that? Honestly, I mean, I've been asking myself this question. I've asked other colleagues. My brother is a physician, a pharmacist, I'm sorry. We talk about this oftentimes, other medical science liaisons in the field. And we honestly don't have an answer as to why they do not prioritize the population. But we're just hoping that with more talks like these and more exposure, that it will become a priority and people will realize that it is important to have adequate representation in the research, because again, you have things like different side effects that could come out, once a drug is marketed, because more people are using it that were not represented in the clinical research trials. So we just have to realize that, the research itself and the populations that are used in research should also be representation of the populations that will use it, the widespread populations that are out there in the communities that will use the drugs or the devices.
Right. And I think, one of the difficulties, we talk about this, when research trials are set up, there are certain criteria that will make one person eligible and make another person ineligible, right? And often you want to try to get the best result and show that that result was most closely associated with your drug or your intervention or your procedure. And in order to do that, you try to get people who are otherwise as healthy as possible, right? We know they have a chronic condition, but you try to get the rest of the noise out of there. And I think that part of the issue is that when we look at populations that have more what we call comorbid conditions, meaning other conditions like diabetes, high cholesterol, heart disease, things like that, when you exclude those people automatically, right? If their conditions are not well controlled, then that's probably not a good person to be in the study. But there's some people who may be pretty well controlled, and when we exclude all of those people from the studies, we may automatically miss out on certain populations. But also, we wind up experimenting more when the drug comes out, because we're going to give these people the medication because they need it. And so we're either going to find out about it in the study, or we're going to find out about it after it comes out and we have to give it to people. So, I think that we also have to look at some of that criteria to make sure that we're not automatically excluding certain populations because they may have, certain conditions that may, muddy the results, or even look at ways to maybe have one group that is a little bit more healthier group, and then another group that maybe has some of those conditions, so we can understand those interactions and things like that.
Yeah,
So,
I was going to
yeah.
say the same thing, that, maybe we would have to have cohorts or specific
Hmm.
groups within the trials for that
Yeah.
specific reason.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk about what other types of research can people be involved in. And so, one of my other messages is, there are many people who want to be involved in clinical trials. Again, people don't know where to find out about research. I think that, potentially creating or, making widely available search engines where you can look for a study in your area may be helpful. Clinicaltrials.gov has it all there, but it's kind of hard to read.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's
Even
true.
when I try to read it, sometimes I have trouble. I'm like, just send me the summary. Don't
Yeah.
send me over there, right? So we need to make patient-friendly resources where people can say, okay, I got MS. I
Mhm.
live in Massachusetts. What's going on around here, right? So that's one way. But also, some people, clinical trials are not for everybody, right? But that doesn't mean that research is not for everybody.
Mhm.
I tell people I've been doing research since I was a kid. I used to go try out different types of Coca-Cola. I used to try on different jeans, market research,
Uh-huh.
anything, right? So what other kind of research can people be involved in aside from clinical trials?
Oh, well, they have qualitative research, they have surveys.
Hmm.
Even within clinical trials, sometimes you have research that's just focused on what they call patient reported outcomes. So
Hmm.
you have questionnaires, and it may be on a tablet, it may be paper based. You may use diaries just to report specific symptoms that you may have. And you might not be on any type of drug, but it's just to report the symptoms that you have, how often you have them. If there's any change, and it might not be symptoms, it's just maybe how you feel.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are many different ways, right? So there are different types of, registries, as you said.
Hmm.
There is the African American MS registry called NAMSAR. There are other registries. I know that Dr. Liliana Amescua has a Hispanic MS registry. There are other general registries, groups such as the Accelerated Cure Project have registries. And also, let's talk a little bit about this idea of patient powered research, which I think is really important. As a researcher, who does not live with the condition that I treat on a regular basis, over the course of my career, I've learned it's very important to listen to people, right? As a MS neurologist, I want to know what causes MS, what
Hmm.
is the pathophysiology, tell me about the cells and all that. But people want to know, okay, what food should I be eating?
Hmm.
How should I be working out? What can I do to help myself? And so let's talk a little bit about the importance of keeping the patient at the center of the research that we're doing, right? So we need to find out all these things about all the cells and all of that, but we also need to keep in mind that we need to think about solutions that will help people right now on a day-to-day basis.
Hmm. I think that as a patient, I can speak, for myself as a patient. I think that if there was some type of way in which we can involve many physicians to get reports from their patients,
Hmm.
just from every visit, whether it's at a 6-month frequency or annual frequency, just having us patients kind of document and look from time to time of what's changed, whether it's things that we're doing ourselves, or it could be environmental factors or social factors that have changed in our life that cause our symptoms to go away or maybe exacerbate or something. But some type of way in which physicians prioritize patients, like you said, they're reporting on a more frequent basis, and not just trust the patient to just tell you when something is happening, but
Right.
to really promote the fact that patients should be reporting these things. I don't know if it should be questionnaires, that
Hmm.
maybe go out monthly, just
Hmm.
so that you can get an idea, or diaries, just
Hmm.
to give an idea of what's actually happening on a day to day. Because a lot can change between the time in which I may see you or someone
Right.
may see their doctor. A lot changes.
Right.
Sometimes you forget about certain things. And, us patients, we're not always going to remember. So if there's a way in which we're talking about it, or it's in the forefront of our mind,
Hmm.
then, you can have a better idea of what's happening from, month to month. for
Yeah,
sure.
and I think that's really important. So I encourage people to bring me lists. They bring me their calendars, their smart, memos. Sometimes they bring me a person who
Mhm.
can report to me what's been going on with them. But I think all of that is very important. I think it's also important, in the research community to make sure, one of the things I thought was really unique about the way we did the Chimes trial was that we had patients involved from the very conception of the trial.
Mhm.
And there were some things that we as researchers were like, nah, nobody's gonna go for that. And the patients are like, no, no, we want to do the best study possible. We want, and it was like, oh, okay, well, maybe we need to change the way that we think. And so I think again, it's about making sure that we include that voice, right, as we're creating some of these protocols and not assuming that we know what people want or what people will or won't do, without including that voice. And so, I found that to be really, really valuable, particularly with groups like Accelerated Cure Project, where essentially the collective patient community helps create the ideas for the research projects that they want to support.
Mhm.
And oftentimes they will be focused on lifestyle modification, whereas I may want to look at MRI outcomes and some very, very specific MRI thing. And somebody's like, okay, I need to know about exercise.
Mhm. I think that that's a very good point, and
Mm-hmm.
things that people don't necessarily think about from the outside, if you're not in research anyways,
Mm-hmm.
are compliance, and that's very
Yeah.
big when it comes to patients. So if a patient is involved in the very beginning or the inception of the trial,
Mm-hmm.
they can even tell you, well, this is too many visits, or this is
Right.
too many blood draws, or whatever the
Right.
case, in which
Right.
oftentimes patients skip visits for whatever
Right.
reason. And when there's
Right.
low compliance, you're also not getting accurate data results from
Right.
the trial. So I think that's a
Right.
very important point.
Right. And I've been a really big advocate of making sure that we as a research community recognize that people are doing us a favor by participating in these studies. They are donating their time, their blood, their, bodies for examinations, etc. And of course, we have to have good science, but we also have to think about how can we make it a little bit more convenient for people to be involved, because they are helping us to advance the science, right?
Hmm.
And also for marginalized communities who may not have as many resources, you're absolutely right. It's hard to get a day off of work to come sit somewhere all day and do all these examinations. And you got who's gonna watch your kids? Who's
Yeah.
gonna watch, that elderly person that you're taking care of? Who's gonna pay for
Hmm.
that grocery money that I'm missing, while I'm in the study? And so I think we have to be more conscientious about that and making sure that we are doing our best to make research accessible to everyone.
Hmm.
And then one last thing I want to talk about, which exercise is right up your alley before we kind of end, that time went by really fast, is let's talk a little bit about lifestyle modification, particularly exercise. So this is a really interesting area where there's become a lot more, well, I won't say a lot, but there's becoming an increasing interest in exercise and understanding how that impacts MS. And I think that better understanding that, the key to that will be research.
Hmm.
So tell us a little bit about your interest, how you got interested in, exercise and its effects on MS, and what you think the next direction we need to move in better researching that aspect of, lifestyle modification.
Okay. Well, I grew up playing sports, so I was always playing sports. So it's just in me that
Mm-hmm.
I'm
What
active.
sports did you play?
I played soccer growing up. I
Uh-huh.
played basketball.
Mm-hmm.
Post college, I played flag football, semi contact flag football. And so
Mm-hmm.
I've just always been active, and I try to
Mm-hmm.
stay active. I mean, my brothers played football in college as well. So we're just an active family. My mom is 66 and she goes to the gym every day, like
Mm-hmm.
faithfully every day.
Right.
Um, so I think that exercise is important, not necessarily only for MS, but for a lot of chronic indications.
Mm-hmm.
It's just good to stay active in general,
Right.
for aging as well. So
Mm-hmm.
although I am a new diagnosed patient, I'm still learning what exercises may help me versus others. But I will say that I think the fact that I exercised already, or that I was physically fit, I think that that helped with my diagnosis and maybe even slowed some of my symptoms to an extent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, I was a little bit slow when I first was diagnosed, but I think probably within maybe, let's say, 4 to 5 weeks, I started kind of coming back to full strength or full activity, I should say. And I think that maybe even the fact that I already worked out, I already had some type of muscle tone that probably helped with my recovery, if you will, call it that.
Absolutely. And I think it's really fascinating. So I'm really fascinated with this, idea about exercise as well as this idea of prehabilitation, right? Which has been used in a lot of different areas. Particularly, we've heard about it most associated with like surgeries, right? Somebody's going to have a hip surgery or knee
Hmm.
surgery.
Yep, this is
You
true.
work out, get yourself in the best shape possible so that when you encounter that insult, you can hopefully recover more quickly.
Hmm.
And so I've been really fascinated in this idea of people getting involved in exercise and physical activity from the time of diagnosis. It'd be great if they were doing it before,
Hmm.
but not waiting until something bad happened to you,
Hmm.
like you got weak, but really kind of working on improving and optimizing that physical fitness, which helps with brain health, which helps with so many symptoms. I'm like,
Yep.
listen, if you start moving, it helps with constipation, it helps with stress, it helps
Everything.
with fatigue,
Yep.
right? So exercise, and so I think that this is extremely important. I think this is very empowering for people to think about something you can do, to help yourself and to help your MS, and again, it looks different for each person. It does
Hmm.
not necessarily have to be putting on your, Adidas outfit and, pumping iron for an hour and getting on the treadmill for an hour. It could be, 10,
A
20
simple
minutes of getting
walk.
your heart rate.
Yeah,
Yeah,
a
going
simple
for a
walk.
walk. You can walk in place at the house. You know
Hmm.
what I mean? Like they got all kind of stuff that you can do. And so I think that this is really important. I think this is really going to be one of the next biggest phases of our understanding of how to really improve quality of life with multiple sclerosis. And so I see some of my colleagues, who are logging in, who are involved in exercise research, but I think that it's really important. And there's some exercise studies that are currently going on in combination with the University of Alabama, focused on people with MS who do have some difficulty with mobility. So I think that this is extremely exciting. I'm very excited about the fact that there's research about lifestyle modification, exercise, stress reduction, meditation, yoga, all the things, because as, a clinician and as a researcher, I certainly want to understand all the underlying stuff, but ultimately I want to help the people that are sitting in front of me.
Hmm.
So if there's a prescription I can give somebody that they can go home and do, that will empower them and help them to do better, I'm all for it, 110%. So with that being said, we have kind of come to the end of our time. I probably could spend a whole nother hour talking about this. But thank you so much for your insight, both as a researcher, as well as a person living with multiple sclerosis. You are such an inspiration. I see
Thank
you
you.
traveling all over the place,
Thank you.
doing your thing. And so I'm really excited that you were able to come spend some time with us this evening. So, what would your advice be, to that person who's living with MS or any condition, right? Who's maybe like, I don't know if I want to be involved in research. Why should I be involved in any kind of research? What would your advice to them be?
Well, I think it's simple. At this point, if you're not involved and you feel reservation or hesitation in being involved in clinical research, how can we ever change, the outcome in terms of having adequate or accurate representation amongst our people?
Right.
And I mean, I have to say the same about myself. I've been in research for all these years, and then once I got diagnosed, I was like, well, this is full circle. Like, I need to find a clinical trial to be in, because how can I be working in clinical research and not be a patient in clinical research? You have to be a
Right.
part of the research. You can't rely on everyone else to supposedly give the data that we need. So if you are someone who is interested in clinical trials research, or you have some type of indication, I would go ahead and look up a clinical trial research. I mean, clinical trial itself. Talk to your physician about it. Talk to someone if
Mhm.
you know someone in the industry, and just try to get involved how you can. I think it can
Absolutely.
only help everyone.
Absolutely. Great resources include, some of our societies and foundation, like the National MS Society. Sometimes they have, lists of different clinical trials that are going on with MS. Clinicaltrials.gov, if you can wade through it, you can get the basic information and then go look it up, but also making sure you contact your physician. If your physician is not involved in research, often if you live anywhere near an academic center,
That's true.
like you may not go to, let's say, Cleveland Clinic, but you may live near there, or Mayo Clinic, or any of your major academic centers. They're often conducting research, on whatever condition you have. So I've had people even call, the research department, say, do you have any studies going on, that maybe I could be, involved in. And so, get in where you fit in, but also stand up and be counted, right? Because if we all don't become a part of the solution, then the problem is never going to get solved. So, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your expertise. Thank you to all of those who've been watching Brain Chat. I hope you get something out of this. And I will see you guys again in 2 weeks. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.
You're absolutely welcome.